From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Friday, November 7th, 2014. 43 students have gone missing in Mexico, and the country has rallied to demand answers. We'll go live to Mexico City to speak with Laura Carlson about the case and why it has captured so much attention. And Who We Be, the Colorization of America. Acclaimed author Jeff Chang joins us in studio to discuss his new book on race and culture wars in the United States. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Christina Mislan. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Christina.
Hello, Sonali.
Now, Ukraine's government reported this morning with alarm the news of dozens of Russian tanks and trucks crossing its border. The armed convoy includes 16 howitzer artillery systems. The provocative move by Russia may be in response to reports of Kiev's assault in the eastern Ukrainian city of Donetsk yesterday, aimed at pro-Russian rebels. Ukraine's defense ministry announced it had killed 200 fighters and destroyed military equipment. A September 5th ceasefire, which had stemmed the rate of casualties, now hangs in the balance. More than 4,000 people have died in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which both the European Union and the U.S. are mired in. Now, Christina, could this latest escalation between Ukraine and Russia break the ceasefire, you think?
Sure. I think it's hard to say, but I do think that historically we've seen this happen many times where there's an incident or event that will happen after a ceasefire, and the ceasefire will end quickly. And we've seen this with Israel and Palestine, for instance. I think the problem here is the nature of ceasefires. They mostly emphasize military concerns. They're very short term. And so what we have to ask is, to what extent do these ceasefire agreements really help the people of, for instance, in this case, Ukraine? And really, so what we really need are diplomatic solutions instead, that really get at the heart of what's going to work in a peaceful way and peaceful manner for people of Ukraine, instead of a conversation that's about two governments, two interests, that where one gets labeled as pro-Western and the other one gets labeled as anti-Western. We really need to have a conversation on what are those diplomatic solutions that might extend beyond the military concerns.
Now, several weeks ago, an explosive New York Times investigation into the 2003 U.S. war in Iraq revealed that troops had indeed found chemical weapons, albeit left over from an era when Iraq was a U.S. ally. Now, the Pentagon has admitted that hundreds of U.S. troops were exposed to the chemicals, but that their complaints had been covered up. Among the chemicals they were exposed to were sarin and sulfur agents. The admission by the Pentagon is notable in that it now places responsibility for care of the troops on the government. No mention was made of Iraqi civilians who might have been exposed. The Times surmised that the admission implies, quote, foreign soldiers, private contractors, and Iraqi troops and civilians may also have been at risk. Now, Christina, obviously the cover-up began under President Bush's term, but why do you think the Obama administration stayed silent on this issue until now?
Well, I think first thing is first is that we have to place this news in light of other events and news, such as the issue of surveillance in the U.S. Postal Service. I think despite whatever Obama's interests may be here, there definitely is a growing need and concern to hold the government accountable for both its domestic and international practices. So I welcome the reporting of this issue, regardless of why it's been silent. Definitely is an issue, but we're seeing that over and over again. Throughout the history of U.S. and U.S. foreign policy, so many things happen in covert operations, but eventually we find out about it and we can place it in context of these international consequences of U.S. foreign policy. I do think in an effort to adjust some of his language after the midterm elections, we also have to take that into play here and see how is President Obama, I should say, use this and frame what's going to happen in the next 2 years. How are we framing the Republican majority that we have in Congress now? I think some of this language does help us kind of give us insight into a lot of the Republican political interests and practices, although President Obama has extended many of those. And so it's hard to say what his motives are here, but there are some questions that we should ask about what's going to happen in the next 2 years and how this frames that.
Finally, Belgians stormed the streets of Brussels yesterday in a major demonstration denouncing austerity measures proposed by their new government. More than 100,000 people marched and were met by water cannons and tear gas from police. Among the measures being considered by the government are cuts to social services, elimination of wage increases, and an increase in the retirement age. The march comes one day after activists in cities around the world gathered on Guy Fawkes Day, proclaiming themselves anti-capitalist. Central London was the epicenter of that gathering, called the Million Mask March, which had been organized by the hacktivist collective Anonymous. Activist and comedian Russell Brand attended alongside thousands who donned V for Vendetta masks. Now, Christina, Europeans seem to be a lot more organized against economic inequality than Americans. Is that a cultural difference on how we view class, you think?
Yes, of course. Any conversation about class in the US is a hard one to have, particularly because of what some people are now calling this divide between the haves and will haves. It's no longer the haves and have-nots, but it's the haves and the people who aspire to have. And part of this is obviously the ideology, the false kind of logic of the American dream. And so we really have a culture of kind of an unfettered, consumerist-centered society that really hides real conversations about workers' rights, class interests, even how we define who's low, middle, and upper class really is a cultural, it's political and economic, of course, but it's also cultural.
Right.
And we have a way in which establishment has made it where we have these hegemonic ideologies that really allow us to hide conversations about class and class struggle and interest.
Christina Mislan, always a pleasure to have you. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Our daily Newsflash guest expert is Christina Mislan. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Since 2006, over 22,000 people have gone missing in Mexico. On September 26th, 43 young men were added to that list. This week, almost 2 months since the 43 went missing, authorities finally arrested Iguala Mayor Jose Luis Abarca and his wife Maria de los Angeles Pineda for their alleged role in the disappearance. Authorities believe that the mayor ordered the police to attack the students because they had plans to disrupt Pineda's speech. After the police shot and killed 6 students, witnesses say they handed the remaining students over to the Guerreros Unidos gang. Since Abarca's arrest, federal officials discovered that the Guerreros Unidos were routinely paying off the mayor at the rate of $220,000 every few weeks. The investigation into the students' disappearance has led to the unearthing of 38 bodies buried in dozens of mass graves. Although government officials used DNA tests to determine that the bodies were not those of the 43 students, parents of the missing men question those claims. With thousands of people killed at the hands of the drug cartels each year, the Mexican public seems to have reached a tipping point with this incident. A big part of the frustration also stems from what the public sees as total impunity from police and government officials. This week, over 100,000 people marched through the streets of Mexico City to demand justice for the missing students, as well as an end to corruption at the highest levels of Mexican society. My guest is Laura Carlson. She is the director of the Mexico City-based Americas program of the Center for International Policy. She's also a columnist for Foreign Policy in Focus and host of a program on Telesur English. She now joins us via live video chat. Welcome to Uprising, Laura.
Thank you, Sonali.
Well, let's first start with why you think this particular incident has gained such traction in the imagination of the Mexican public, why it has captured so much attention and seems to symbolize a lot of anger over something that's been happening for years.
Yeah, that's right. I think there are two main reasons in this case. First of all, it's because they're students at this rural teaching college called Ayotzinapa, in Guerrero. And the reason that this is important is because they're college students, which kind of strikes a chord that they were the victims in this case, but also because of particularly what this school means. This school is one of a series of rural teaching colleges for very poor indigenous families in Guerrero, and it offers them one of their only opportunities to get out of that poverty. And they also have a long history of student activism because they were born out of the Mexican Revolution with Mexican revolutionary ideals built into the curriculum of the school. So they've been a pillar of the student movement for a long time. In fact, they were getting ready to go to participate in the commemoration of the student massacre of 1968, when they were attacked in this sense. And so there's a strong sense that there's a part of this that has to do with political repression of the student movement, and that's what's ignited in many ways the students themselves. Then the other factor of it is that these were police officers who attacked the students, who abducted the students that are disappeared, and who, according to all reports, delivered them into the hands of organized crime with probably a fairly good idea of what was going to happen after that, although, of course, we don't really know for sure yet. So the fact that there were actually state agents involved, and not another case you could simply chalk up to drug war violence in the country, but that was so integrally involved with the state and in the police in this case, and there's evidence that there were also federal police and army soldiers that were in the area at the same time as the students were being attacked, has also revealed this whole system of corruption that people sort of knew about, but not in the same direct manner that this case illustrates. So those are the two factors that have really created a mass mobilization in Mexico, but particularly among the youth.
Now, Laura, let's focus a little bit more on this case itself. Many of the parents of the missing 43 men think that the government knows where their bodies are or where they might be if they are indeed still alive. In fact, is there any hope that they might still be alive? And is there this sense that those bodies that were discovered might indeed be those of the students?
Well, anyone who's a parent knows that until there's definitive proof that your child has been killed and you actually have a body that you can bury, there's always hope. And that's the position that the parents are in right now. And they will not accept any kind of verdict that the students have been killed, including testimony from some members of organized crime that have been arrested, until those bodies are delivered. And of course, there's still hope in the demand among all of society is that the students be returned safely and alive. So yes, there's still hope. The government originally came out and said that in the graves, none of them were identified as being the students according to DNA testing. They subsequently came out and admitted that there were huge problems in their process of collecting that DNA material and testing it. And the parents have stated that they will not accept any results regarding that until the Argentine forensics team weighs in on what has happened with, or who these people in the unidentified graves are, and if they really are the students or not. So everyone's kind of waiting on the Argentines to come out with the results of their own testing. And meanwhile, we have more graves turning up that will have to be tested as well. It's a process that apparently can take several weeks or even months because of the difficulty and the fact that in these cases, many of the bodies were semi-burned. And so the remains, are not in excellent conditions for that kind of testing. But that's where we are on this. There's a lot of confusion, but the parents are steadfast in not accepting any results until there's definitive scientific proof that that they have the bodies of their children.
Now, Laura, if those bodies are not identified as those of the students, that still leaves the question of who they are. If mass graves are showing up in this part of the country, someone's being killed, someone's life is being snuffed out, and their bodies are being disposed of.
Yes, that's the third factor that's so shocking about this case, is that they go searching for these 43 students and they keep finding bodies and bodies. all throughout the hills in the surrounding area. And some of them may be the students and many of them may not be. And the question arises of who they are. And there's still no results whatsoever in testing that. Parents are coming forward from the region who have disappeared children or young adults usually, and asking that there be DNA testing on that, and saying, at least with this case, people know what we've been up against. We've been reporting and pressuring the government to do something about our missing loved ones for years because we knew this situation was going on. And in fact, the people in the region are not that surprised about these graves because they did know that this was going on, that there were people being disappeared and presumably assassinated throughout the region. So while it's not entirely surprising, and there's other regions, Tamaulipas and some parts of the border, where we know that this has happened before and that continues to happen, it still is very shocking to say, what kind of a society do we live in where you go looking for 43 students that have been abducted by the police and you find mass graves of people whose bodies have just been disposed of and never even identified.
So, Laura, the situation at the heart of what was happening in the city, in this town in Guerrero, you have a mayor who was being paid off by a criminal gang, and then you have the police who are supposed to be protecting ordinary people, but were also involved. And we find out that this criminal gang, the Guerreros Unidos, were paying the mayor $220,000 equivalent every few weeks. What sort of relationship do we know now existed between the mayor and these criminal gangs? And also, if the police are so involved, then who is doing the arresting? What sort of authorities can anybody rely on if those who are supposed to be doing the arresting might be part of the same organization that's doing the killing or accomplice with the criminal gangs?
That's exactly the problem. What we know is that there was complete collusion between the local government and the Guerreros Unidos gangs. In fact, it seems to be a family affair because the accusation of the Attorney General now is that his wife, Maria Pineda Villa, who you mentioned, her brothers have been involved in Guerreros Unidos. 2 of them were assassinated for that reason. Another one is on the run, and that she is accused of being the local leader in Iguala of Guerreros Unidos. So it's not even just a problem of corruption, like paying off a local official, but that there's this complete working together in a daily way within the organization and within the city itself. The money was going directly to pay off police officers so that they knew that they had pretty much the entire municipal police force in their pocket. Now, the government, what it's done about this is it's gone in and said, this is not just Iguala. And they've actually taken over 13 municipal governments, sent in the federal government, essentially declared that the municipal government no longer is functional for what it should be doing, particularly in the area of public security. So this is a huge major thing. And of those 13, there are many people who say that of more than 80 townships in the state of Guerrero, probably 70 of them are in these conditions. The problem now, and this is where the debate comes in between the Attorney General and the federal government's version of things and what the students are saying, and that is, how far up does this go? How systematic is this? The government continues to say, well, we're taking care of a case where local government officials were bought off by organized crime. It's like the good guys somehow passed over to the side of the bad guys. The students are saying it's not that simple. These governments, we've been reporting about corruption and the collusion with organized crime in these governments for years. The state government has protected them, and the federal government has protected them. So what's really going on? They're saying we're facing a system that is corrupt to its core. And you can get rid of all the bad apples you want, but that's not going to fix the problem. And that's why the demand of the marches has gone all the way up the line. And when you see those tens of thousands of people pouring into the Zócalo, the Central Plaza in Mexico City, their demand is dump Peña. Is that the President Peña Nieto resign immediately.
Wow. Now, let's also talk about the fact that this particular case involved 43 men. They were all men, but women have been long the targets of disappearances, particularly in places like Ciudad Juarez in Mexico for many, many years. That's a sort of a mystery that has never been fully solved. And are people making connections to those murders as well of women?
Yes, because the connections are being made now to the overall number of disappearances that you mentioned. There's a lot of discussion and debate about the numbers. It's impossible to have one, but they range between the official of 22,000 and some to from non-governmental organizations up to 100,000. And of course, there you also see these disappearances of women specifically that could be linked to the femicides that we've seen in Ciudad Juarez. So all these groups that have been working on disappearances have found in this issue also a way to say, we knew that this was a situation in our country, and amid the tragedy, we have to see this as a very important opportunity to say, this is a structural problem that has to be confronted immediately. Now, the reason that there are links also between these cases is that while the femicides and the disappearances of young women have been going on since the early 90s, they were identified with a bunch of different hypotheses as to why, but a clear focus on young women with sexual abuse and crimes included in that. There's also a very close correlation between a rise in violence against women and disappearances of all kinds and the war on drugs. What we see is when violence increased after the war on drugs, sending the army out into the street, and impunity, the lack of justice ironically increased because, of course, this was supposed to be a law enforcement measure, then all these crimes went up. And part of what we're thinking is happening in that sense is that in this situation of widespread violence, all violent elements, including drug cartels, but including corrupted elements of the state and abusive elements, including security, police, and soldiers, have become more emboldened to act in illegal ways and to act against vulnerable sectors. And of course, women are included in that, and increasingly youth are targeted too. We have a related case called Tlatlaya, where the army went in and, according to all evidence that's been presented, actually executed 21 young people. So we're seeing these kinds of attacks on the population, and progressively this war on drugs is looking like a war on the people, in which you just absolutely cannot distinguish between the state and its security forces and the drug cartels by saying one side's the good guys and one side's the bad guys, because there's so much overlap there and there is so much complicity that it's no longer clear which side is which.
And finally, Laura, this conversation would not be complete if we don't bring in the role of the United States. Of course, the U.S. and Peña Nieto's government are allies, and various other Mexican governments have been allies of the U.S. over the years. The whole concept of the war on drugs is essentially a U.S. idea. These murders and disappearances are happening at the doorstep of the U.S., which of course looks at other parts of the world when similar things happen and sees it as a pretext for intervention, sees it as a pretext for moral high grounds and judgments. But in Mexico, the administration remains silent, almost no matter who is in the White House. So make these links between the U.S. government's policies and its silence and complicity with what's happening in Mexico.
Yes, if the United States does not see this tragedy and the mass mobilizations that are taking place in Mexico right now as a call to immediately end the drug war, and in particular, the Merida Initiative, which has been the major foreign support for the drug war, not only in resources, but also in terms of strong-arming policy to continue with that drug war, even though it's been clear for years, with over 100,000 dead, that it's disastrous for Mexico. If they don't see this as impetus to immediately end that aid and change a foreign policy, then they will be morally responsible for what's happening in Mexico right now, and responsible for not heeding the call of all these young people who say, we don't want this to be our future. We will not accept this as our future. This drug war funding has been fundamental to continuing with the model that's created this type of impunity. It's created these fractions also among drug cartels that leads to greater violence. There's a number of direct relationships there that almost everybody knows about, including the people who are promoting the drug war. So this is a tremendous responsibility. It's actually an opportunity for the US government to review what's happening, to take seriously its responsibility, and to end these policies immediately.
Laura Carlson, thank you so much for joining us today, and we wish you the best of luck in all the reporting you're doing on this.
Thank you, Sonali.
We'll also post a link to Laura's article about these murders. My guest, Laura Carlson, is the director of the Mexico City-based Americas program of the Center for International Policy and a columnist for Foreign Policy in Focus, and host of a program on Telesur English. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, where you can find information about what we have on our program, as well as links to writings by our guests. When we come back, Jeff Chang joins us in studio to discuss his new book, Who We Be, The Colorization of America. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The election of Barack Obama to the presidency of the United States represented an historic moment of such great proportions that the entire world, not just the U.S., was enthralled. Yet we continue to live during a time when Trayvon Martin could be shot and his killer walk away free. Conversations on race are always difficult. That difficulty says much about this nation's history. So it is crucial for us to ask the questions, are we living in a post-racial America, as some would suggest, or do our lived experiences tell us otherwise? In a powerful new book, author Jeff Chang explores the evolution of American culture as it relates to race. The book is called Who We Be, The Colorization of America. In it, Chang explores our history stretching from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech to the adoption of multiculturalism, the resulting white conservative backlash, the election of Barack Obama, more white backlash, and the killing of Trayvon Martin. Jeff Chang's earlier book was Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip-Hop Generation. He's the executive director of the Institute for Diversity in the Arts at Stanford University. He was named by Utne Reader as one of the 50 visionaries who are changing your world. And I'm so pleased to welcome to the program today, Jeff Chang. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So first, let's talk about the fact that you say in your book, race, that word is such a heavy word. It's a complicated word. It is, in your words, the most complicated of American words. Why is that?
It's, driven the nation periodically almost to the brink of dissolution. It's the source of civil and cultural schisms and the resurgent culture wars that I think we've seen during the Obama era. It's the kind of thing that we all ought to be talking about in order for us to get to a more equal, a just society. But the one thing that for whatever reason we seem to have the most difficulty actually addressing.
So while your book is about race, you view race through the prism of culture, of American culture. And this is a culture that is so influential. It has influenced vast portions of the world, whether we like it or not. So American culture is in itself influential, and that culture has been influenced by people of color throughout, which has, of course, led to issues of cultural appropriation, etc. But what do you mean? Even that word culture, as we were talking about race being a difficult word, even culture is a difficult word to define. How do you define it?
Culture is a complex word, but I think it's the realm of ideas, it's the realm of images, it's the realm of stories, it's the narrative that we're all immersed in every day. And oftentimes what we like to say, those of us who are working in the culture, we like to say that cultural change precedes political change, that without a movement in the culture, we can't have the imagination to get to a point where we could even imagine electing a black president. Not to say that this is actually the move towards racial justice, or the last move towards racial justice. In fact, it's just part of the first, but especially during times of political gridlock like we see right now, where it's impossible to imagine change happening in the halls of power, we have to foster that imagination, and culture is where we do that.
So culture includes our writings, our imagery, it includes our music, which I know you've written, of course, your last book
sure.
about hip-hop, but the sort of pop culture we're exposed to. But then there's also commercial advertising,
right.
there's political advertising, how we view one another in all of those spaces. And today with our online world overwhelming us and our access to information, we also have greater access to culture than we've had before, don't we?
Yeah, we're in it every day. Like, we're tweeting, we're on Facebook. I mean, these are all places in which the culture
And thank
is
you for
moving.
tweeting this interview, by the way.
Of course, absolutely. I'm really proud to be here. So it's happening all the time. And one of the things that we like to say is, people often think of change in terms of events, in terms of a judicial decision, or an election, an electoral campaign, a demonstration. But change is happening every single moment. And so if we thought of change more like the ocean, then we can kind of get at what's happening in the culture. There's tides that are moving in and moving out and pushing back, and sometimes these tides gather into a wave, and then we see change happening.
So let's discuss some of these sort of flashpoints of cultural shifts in the country historically. You bring up Ralph Ellison's book in your book, Who We Be, The Invisible Man, this idea of breaking through white-dominated culture. How seminal was that book?
For me, it was really important to kind of go back to that, because it summed up essentially the condition of people of color, of marginalized folks, that, through the 80s, through the 90s, we were invisible. And that would be a kind of invisibility that was about the lack of representation in images and also in institutions that were creating those types of images, but also invisible in terms of the lack of positive or sort of truthful representation, misrepresentation. And so this is a lot of what the multiculturalists who started to begin coming together really in the 70s and naming themselves as such in the 70s were fighting against, fighting against invisibility, saying if we're able to get these stories of underrepresented people, of unheard people told, maybe we'd be able to open up a well of empathy, and from that move towards a consensus for equity.
Right. And I want to get to this idea of multiculturalism, but let's go back even further.
Okay.
King's I Have a Dream speech, of course, a seminal moment in American history that, everyone sort of now agrees. It's become politically correct to agree that even the right will sort of say, yes, of course, that was a crucial moment, and that we're so proud, and look how great we are as America that we had this moment in our history. But at the time, how important was King's sort of rallying cry for Americans to envision this world without racial strife? Was that a sort of a turning point for race in America? And how did that then permeate our culture, his speech? And, people know that one line, but of course his speech was much more than that one line.
Well, and the one line being, that he hopes that his children grow up in a society where they're judged not by the color of the skin, but the content of their character. And this is something that, my kids were learning in elementary school. All the kids are learning in elementary school. They learn parts of the speech. It was so important and pervasive in terms of the way that we began to understand race and racial justice that you begin to see the right adopting that line in the 80s, specifically to undo policies of racial justice, to undo the gains of the civil rights era. And this is sort of a larger point, I think, about culture and the way that it works, is that as progressives, we always have to instill, incept new ideas about how to see the world, about what the world can be. Conservatives then have to argue for keeping everything the same, but they have to do it in the language that we've changed. And so Martin Luther King Jr. changed the language in that way. What I like to refer to as well is the Beyond Vietnam speech, right? The opposite of the March on Washington speech, the speech that all of us as progressives know about, but
Yes.
that doesn't get talked about a lot because it was against the war.
And it identified the U.S. government as a criminal government
Absolutely.
for conducting the war.
And said we have to fight racism and militarism and economic injustice, and that these three things are intimately related to each other. But he also said in that we have to have a radical revolution of values, right? We have to look at ways of instilling new values into the culture. And I think that, you know, the book looks back at the last 50 years, but really it's also looking forward, I think, in some ways to 2042, when we're all supposed to be
Right.
minorities, right?
Right, the minority.
The majority thing, right? Which is like whatever. But the main question, I think, that comes up, and I talk to my students about this, is that if we're all going to be minorities, then how do we form a new majority? And this is where I think culture is crucial, to be able to instill these new values for a culture that pushes towards racial justice and social justice.
So let's talk about this concept of multiculturalism,
Okay.
as you say that it kind of started out in the 1970s, and the idea, and today maybe the word diversity
Yeah.
is part of that pantheon and that concept. But how did that become a tool
Pantheon
to,
of meaningless words.
Yeah, and words that are stripped of any weight that they
Yeah,
might have. So how did multiculturalism become a tool to address race in the United States? And I want to ask you this question in the context of one of the most recent attacks on that concept by the right happened when we had these attacks in the Canadian Parliament, and the right in Canada put all the blame for this as multiculturalism, because we are, we keep putting all cultures on the same level. Islamic radicals are using or taking advantage of our benevolence to attack us. But let's
benevolence,
trace it all the way back to the 70s.
Okay, so let's go back to the, and it's interesting because the early 70s, 1973, I think, is when Canada established a ministry of multiculturalism. They made an official kind of policy. But, at the same time, what's happening is in cities like Los Angeles and New York, Chicago, but particularly the Bay Area, what you see is out of the third world strikes and out of the rise of feminism, and particularly the feminists of color sort of response to second wave feminism, is a lot of cultural work being created. You see sort of a cultural renaissance happening out of the late 60s into the early 70s. And what happens is, especially in the Bay Area, is all of these different kinds of threads begin to come together. And Ishmael Reed starts saying, we're about the multicultural. America's always been about the multicultural. Now, this is a radical idea at the time, because you could, at that time, only imagine one way of being American. It was like this unitary thing, and everybody assimilated to becoming sort of this WASP ideal. That was the way that underrepresented minorities were supposed to behave within American society. So that proposed the idea that America had always been multicultural, that we were a multiculture, was a radical idea. Now it's kind of toothless, right? Now it's completely different. But again, this is sort of this radical way of carving out space for people to be able to tell their stories.
So within this this concept of multiculturalism has emerged now the changed landscape, but only partially changed.
Yeah.
That changed in 2008 in the most heavy way, in the political and cultural earthquake caused by the election of President Barack Obama was quite amazing. I want to ask you about the sort of imagery that emerged from that time, which you talk about in your book. There was first the 2008 imagery of the Shepherd Ferry poster, President Obama colored in red, white, and blue with the word hope under him. Then in 2009, the backlash, a very different image, which
Right.
I'll ask you to describe.
Well, so you literally have this this image of a black and white man. He's literally black and white.
He's literally half, yeah.
Half black, half
his
white,
heritage
right?
is black and white, yeah.
His heritage is black, and he's colorized into this image of hope, right? And immediately people begin to sort of project onto this image of hope and change all of their images of hope and change. So the street art that comes out during this period, which is completely sort of sanctioned by the Democratic Central Committee or anybody else in the party, let alone the Obama campaign. Everybody's like, "What's that? I'm not that." Okay, that's cool, but we're not. That's not us. They start spilling past all of these boundaries of the official party platform, of the official sort of candidate sort of agenda, and into images of environmental justice and immigrant rights and change, people living together in new kinds of ways. And so there's this explosion of street art that I think in some ways for us was like, wow, this is actually something that's happening. It was an image uprising, if you will, right? And immediately what you see is the conservative right looking for images to kind of combat that. And so they take a poster that has been done by, or an image that has been done by an LA Palestinian American who's just been toying with Photoshop and kind of puts together Obama and Heath Ledger's Joker. And so what happens is they put the word socialism underneath that. And in the same way that people were posting Obama Hope posters all across Los Angeles and then across the country, via social media, now you have these posters appearing in Los Angeles and then all across the country of the Obama Joker. And this is Obama now, not as a symbol of hope and change, as an activating image, right? But as an image of everything that we should be fearing, all things other.
It's a grisly image.
It's a grisly image, yeah.
You know, the makeup that they Photoshop onto Obama's face, I mean, it's ghoulish, it's devilish. And of course, the implication with the word socialism underneath, which of course as progressives, we know he's anything but that.
Right, yes. We wish.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that, in a way, sort of culturally represented the backlash in about 2009 when he started his tenure, and almost has continued unabated since.
Absolutely. Obama as Muslim, Obama as a Kenyan, as an illegal alien.
Ebola, which was
Ebola.
Ebola and Obama.
Yeah,
so that's the
Ebola,
latest right-wing invention of President Obama, equating him with a deadly disease.
Right, and so the culture wars have kind of come back in a really, really big way. And so when I first kind of was writing this book, I was like, oh, it's a victory lap. I had drunk the Kool-Aid. Okay, I'll admit that.
Really?
But yeah, and we're going to do a victory lap for multiculturalism.
For
Yeah. And immediately this happens, and then it's sort of like, oh yeah, what was I thinking? And it becomes about the return of the culture wars and this split, right, in the ideas of America between the idea of a grand America that we're in danger of losing forever versus America that's emerging, that's hopeful, that could be transformative, right? And these are the same kinds of culture wars that I was going through as a student in the 80s and the 90s. They're the same kinds of tropes. They've just been sort of the image wars have been updated, and they're much more intense now because we live in an image world.
So I want to ask you, as we've been discussing Obama, to tell us about a man, an artist, a sort of contributor to the culture of the U.S. that you profiled in your book, whose art you profiled throughout your book, a man named Maury Turner, an African-American cartoonist who sort of broke the color line on the funny pages with his comic strip, We Pals. And you have a section in your book where you describe his reaction to the election of Obama as well. But let's talk about him and what his comic strip even represented. I think many young Americans have probably never even heard of him.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of for folks of a certain age, maybe from a certain part of the country, have very fond memories of this comic strip. But okay, so the point that I was trying to make here, and I'm trying to make in the book, is a central role that artists play in changing the way that we see race, see each other, see living together. So when you have the Civil Rights Act passing and the Voting Rights Act passing and the Immigration and Nationality Act passing in the mid-'60s, these begin to tear down the infrastructures of legal segregation. But they can't obviously tell you how you're going to live together, right? And so the artists are the folks who enter there with their visions of what a post-segregated future can look like. And so We Pals, his comic strip, Maury Turner's comic strip, debuts in February of 1965. It's just a couple of weeks before Malcolm X gets assassinated. It's before the Voting Rights Act gets passed. It's before the Watts Uprising here in Los Angeles. But they're kids.
We, as in WEE, little.
Yes, little kids, small kids of all these different backgrounds. I remember being attracted to this comic strip as a kid because they had an Asian American kid in there, a Japanese American kid named George, and going, wow, there's a kid that looks like me, you know. And so it was
And that's powerful, I should say. That's powerful.
It's powerful
For people of color to see themselves represented in pop culture.
Right. So he was inspired by Peanuts, but instead of sort of jokes about Snoopy and the Red Baron, or Lucy and the football, Lucy, Charlie Brown and the football, it's jokes about getting along, so cultural misrecognitions and that kind of stuff, and having them say things that if adults were saying it, there would be all kinds of fights. So there's this one comic, strip that Maury did where it's like the kids are walking around, they're like black power, red power, yellow power, and the Jewish kid comes in and says bagel power, and they're like, bagel power? But it was a kind of thing, if you said black power during that particular time, or you said red power or yellow power, that was going to be a fight.
And that also represents how humor plays a role in our culture.
Yes.
You can say things in humor. Stand-up comics know this.
Yes.
That this is the concept of the jester in the court who can say things that others can't quite get away with yet, and are on the forefront of cultural change. There's also the issue of fine art, and you write about that in your book a little bit with people of color, still to an extent being shut out of the museum spaces. But there were some important breakthroughs throughout our history, and as part of this culture war, where we see multiculturalism, if you will, manifest itself. How important was it for artists of color to break through?
Well, they worked very hard from the late '60s, protesting institutions of the fine arts, or the high arts. So the protests at the Met, at the MoMA, these are kind of stories that have not necessarily been written really into even art history. But artists from Spiral, Norman Lewis, and Faith Ringgold organizing protests to get black art into these spaces during the '60s. And then what you see is in the 1990s, the late '80s and the 1990s, a lot of artists beginning to express themselves around their identity. And an LA artist named Daniel Joseph Martinez in the 1993 Whitney Biennial does these museum tags called, saying, I can't ever imagine wanting to be white. And this causes a huge stir in the New York art world. And what it does in some ways is it takes all of these debates about multiculturalism into that space. That 1993 Biennial is still probably the most diverse show that's ever been represented of American art in history. But the backlash against it, the elite backlash against it, is so thick that it has resonances now in even today's contemporary arts world. Right. There have been controversies over race this past year around the Whitney Biennial and also around Kara Walker's piece, A Subtlety. But there's still sort of a sense in which if you're an artist who's in the contemporary arts world working around race, that in some ways you have to downplay that.
Right. And see, this is an important point that I'd like to focus on for a minute, because when artists of color, when culture makers, trendsetters in marginalized communities have wanted representation in our mainstream, the price they have often had to pay or been asked to pay is what has made them edgy in the first place.
Right, exactly.
And this is not just true in art, it's true, for example, in media at large. We want to see, we as an American society are fine with seeing people of color within white spaces if those people of color behave white. And this goes back to your original idea about waspness being the dominant narrative, and we're constantly fighting that. There's a constant tension around that, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's going back to, I think, the point you made about there being sort of a partial victory here for multiculturalism. In some ways, still people have to mask themselves if they want to go ahead and make that intervention in certain spaces, and particularly in the contemporary arts world.
Right. Don't talk about racism. Don't make your art about racism. Don't make
Right.
your journalism about racism.
Right. Let's downplay all of that
yeah.
kind of stuff.
Of course, a huge part of our pop culture is appropriated, I should say, by commercial, by the commercial world, by commercial entities, by corporations who see what's sparking the imagination of young people and taking that. And I want to bring up a couple of companies and their ad campaigns over the years that you've profiled in your book that have sort of come back to be part of the fabric of American culture, and that's Coke. Coke is one really important company, the Coke-Pepsi wars. And tell us how these two companies, in their quest to sell more of their fizzy sugary drink, tried to establish themselves as quintessentially American, but then that brought into question the whole identity of the whole idea of who an American is.
Right. It's a really interesting thing to think about how, you know, advertising has kind of influenced and absorbed as well sort of multiculturalism and ideas of the way that we see each other. In the 1970s, the early 1970s, Pepsi was the insurgent #2. And so they directly went after targeting youth markets and African American markets.
Right.
They were one of the first companies to really have a lot of African American marketers on their staff. And Coke is looking at this insurgency, and Coke actually has this history of having a lot of bottlers who were in white citizens councils in the South. And so, you know, Pepsi's going after
Which
the
are
African
linked to the
American,
KKK.
right? Which then Pepsi says, okay, we're going to go and outflank them on this kind of thing. And so they look at this, and by the 70s, they're thinking, how do we deal with this insurgency? And that's when you see the Coke commercial that we, again, people of a certain age have all seen. I'd like to teach the world to sing. The commercial in which you have all the people of the world standing on this Italian hill holding Coke bottles, right, dressed in kimonos and dirndls and all the kinds of ethnic signifiers that you could imagine for that.
Which at the time was challenging, but I mean, of course, with the passage of time seems trite.
But with the Super Bowl ad that they did last year, America's Beautiful, right? They, in some ways, kind of brought that debate back. And here you have a corporation saying, we're not down with Islamophobia, which is a really kind of interesting thing on the biggest day, advertising day of the year. But then what does it really mean at the end of the day?
It means they want to sell more sugary drinks, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's also the Italian clothing company Benetton, whose United Colors of Benetton literally took the idea of multiculturalism and translated into a way to sell their clothes. It was also sort of daring at its time, and at the heart of this advertising campaign was a very interesting man who you profile. Tell us a little bit about what that ad campaign represented for this sort of growingly popular idea that multiculturalism is a good thing. Yeah.
Well, again, Benetton's sort of this insurgent company. They're from outside of the U.S. They're trying to break in to the U.S. In order to reach, the biggest markets that they can possibly reach. And so this advertising genius, in some ways, Oliviero Toscani, decides that he's going to start making pictures of all of these beautiful kids from all these different, races against white backgrounds, all wearing Benetton sweaters. So it's like all of the people of the world wearing the same colored clothes or the same sort of, United Colors of Benetton. A new vision of global capitalism that really, in a lot of respects, U.S. companies were not ready to deal with it at that point, and only really begin to pivot after the Los Angeles riots, really. So they were really far kind of seeing in that way. But at the same time, it's an interesting vision. Like, are you saying that all of this difference should add up to a new kind of conformity? Is that what you're saying? It was a very kind of contradictory type of message, and eventually the Benetton ads kind of collapsed under all these different kinds of contradictions.
So let's talk about television.
Sure.
Television is a very, very problematic field of pop culture because there was a lot of progress that happened in American television just in terms of representation of people of color, at least certain minority groups, that we seem to have lost, and maybe we might be seeing a resurgence of again today. The Cosby Show and some of these shows back in the day did break some barriers, didn't they?
And then we have now the ABC fall lineup, which they're going all in on non-white leads and non-white families, which is really interesting, right? Kind of building on Modern Family and Scandal. So the interesting thing is at the turn of the 80s into the 90s, you have Fox trying to become the fourth network, just like Pepsi was trying to become the top dog in the Coke wars, in the Cola wars. And so they go after, again, young audiences, and they go after African-American audiences. So you see The Simpsons on the one hand, and then Living Color on the other. And then there's this flowering of black television, what folks call the golden age of black TV during the early 90s. As soon as Fox gets the NFL contract, they say, okay, we don't need these black shows anymore.
Wow.
And they're gone. Within 2 years, all of them are gone. And so this gets to our larger point, right, which is that how much can you really depend upon the market as your sort of vanguard for racial progress? Really not that much.
Right.
And identity now is the currency of global capitalism. It's right down to the thing of opening your Amazon page and saying, if you liked Who We Be, the colorization of America, buy this book by,
They're constantly trying to profile us and trying to fit what our buying patterns might be, which is based on our identity.
Exactly. Yeah, trying to reduce our identity to sort of just a consumer identity.
So let's talk about political campaigns and how
Sure.
they have played on culture, how they have sort of in many ways forced certain issues to be and also in many ways perverted notions of multiculturalism. And like what we were talking about with the Canadian Parliament, trying to point out the pitfalls of multiculturalism. And let's talk about, not only did we have Nixon's Southern strategy, which very much played on culture wars and racist ideology.
And is very much alive now.
And is
we
very
saw
much
this,
alive now,
We saw this,
absolutely.
this past Tuesday.
Yes, and definitely bring that up. But also we had, of course, in the middle there, Lee Atwater, who
Yes.
George H.W. Bush's campaign manager, who played on the standard white fear of blackness with the Willie Horton ads. The Willie Horton ads sort of stand out as perhaps the worst point in political campaigning when it came to race. How important a moment was that?
It was absolutely an important moment because it reconfigured the Southern strategy for a new era. You couldn't make these explicitly racist appeals anymore by the time you get to the 80s. But what the Willie Horton ad did was to codify sort of racial appeals to whites in the South and sort of conservative appeals in a way that didn't put the language of race up front. It was very explicit in that way.
Well, Jeff, unfortunately we're out of time. Much more to discuss,
Yes.
but our listeners in the Bay Area can see Jeff Chang speak on Monday, November 10th at 7:30 p.m. at the First Congregational Church. More information at kpfa.org. Jeff Chang, thanks so much for joining us. We've been talking about Jeff's book, Who We Be, The Colorization of America. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our producer and program director. Michael Casey, Camilo Ramirez, and Christian Beck are our interns. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Our theme music is by Quetzal. Find us online at uprisingwithsonali.com. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube under the handle Uprising Radio. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you on Monday.